So we're at Neve Yerushalayim College for Women, and we're working through the Mystical Hebrew Alphabet series, and right now we're in the middle of the Hebrew letter Hey, and we said before that Hey is a combination of a physical Dalet and a spiritual Yud. And yesterday we worked on the fact that it says in Bereshit, Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, Behi Baram, that God created the heavens and the earth. This is the verb for He created them. You can see the bara, created root, Reish Aleph, is the word for create, and it had a small hey. Rashi said that small hey hints the fact that our world was created with a hey. And when we ran out of time yesterday, we were about to discuss the idea of how did Rashi see this? In other words, Rashi doesn't, in his commentary on the Torah, Rashi lived in France from 1040 to 1105 CE, he lived about 1,000 years ago. And in his commentary on the Torah, when he explains things in the verse that do not make sense, he does not make up his answers. He always has an oral Torah source. He goes to the Talmud, that's oral Torah, and looks up answers. He goes to the Medrash, that's oral Torah, looks up answers. There's something called the Zohar, which is oral Torah, and he can look up answers. So Rashi is just bringing answers from other places. He's not guessing. And therefore, where's the indicator that is the basis for the oral Torah information that a small hey teaches that our world was created with a hey? I mean, it's a beautiful insight, but how does oral Torah from Mount Sinai see that hinted in the verse? And the answer is like this. It's actually based on the graphic design of the word. Because if the hey were the same size as all the other letters, you would be inclined to read it as one word. Behi Baram, He created them. But when God contracts the second letter of the word Behi Baram, He graphically has designed the word in three sections. He's got a big section, which is regular sized letters. He's got a contracted smaller section. And then he's got a big section. Do you follow? So really, graphically, the word looks like three subsections. Now, beit as a prefix can mean with. So if we read the b prefix as with, we can read this word as b. With a hey, baram, He created them. With a hey, He created them is how you read the word in thirds, and that's where the oral Torah is getting it from. That created them with a hey is the hint that our world was created with a hey. Okay? So now, let's move on to what does God grammatically do with this hey that brings that integration in the physical and the spiritual together. And the answer is fascinating, because in Hebrew grammar, typically, a hey is a letter that transitions a gender. So if we take a simple Hebrew word, like the word yeled, which is a boy, and we add a hey that integrates the physical and spiritual together to the masculine word boy. So the word yeled, which lacks that hey, when you add a hey of integration of the physical and spiritual, it becomes the word yelda. So as a general rule, masculine words in Hebrew typically lack the hey that integrates the physical and spiritual together. It would fall in this spot right here, theoretically. And feminine words typically have the hey that integrates the physical and spiritual together, which is a roundabout way of saying that the feminine gender has a certain level of completion that the masculine gender lacks. Because I said a few times before that there's no way to complete yourself unless there's a healthy balance between the physical and the spiritual. That hey represents the integration of both together. So why is it in a certain level that the feminine gender has that completion, that integration of the physical and spiritual together, that the masculine gender lacks? And for that, we're going to need to get a broader definition of what masculine and feminine mean. I'll tell you why. Because in American culture growing up, masculine and feminine really refer to a sexual differentiation, either in humans or in animals or even in plants, right? You can have male, female plants, I assume. I know you can have them in animals. So culturally, what was I exposed to as a kid growing up? What's masculine, what's feminine? So, I mean, you know, look at the movies. Like masculine was leather jackets, drinking beer, and driving Harley Davidson motorcycles, right? That was masculine. And when I was a kid, feminine was leather jackets, drinking beer, and driving Harley Davidson motorcycles. I grew up in a confusing time, but whatever. But you got the idea. That's a cultural bias. What's male, female as far as the Torah goes? So it's interesting that if these are the building blocks for creation, if this is the DNA, the alphabet, then that means that in the meanings of the letters is the basis for how the world functions. And not only that, grammar has to track how the world functions, because there's no coincidence. God didn't make a language separate from Torah. This language is a part of an information system. So the rules have to follow how the world runs. Does that make sense? So therefore, in English, we have a masculine gender and a feminine gender, but we also have a neutral gender. There's a category called it, which is neither male or female. If I say pass the book to me, I'm allowed to, in English, to say pass it to me, because a book has no gender. Why is that in English? Because English is largely based on Latin. And in Latin, there is a neutral gender. There's masculine, feminine, and neutral. Now guess what? Torah Hebrew has no neutral gender. Torah Hebrew only has masculine and it has feminine. But technically speaking, there's no it. The word it in Hebrew has to have gender. It has to be a masculine it and a feminine it. But in English, there's no such thing. There's neutral. So, one second. If God runs the world according to Torah, and these are the building blocks, these rules of how the world functions, so when God says, I didn't create Torah Hebrew with a neutral gender, guess what he's teaching you about the world? There's no neutral. If there was neutral out there, there'd have to be a way to use the DNA to describe it. And God says, I don't have a neutral gender. I didn't create anything neutral. The only exception to that would be God, because God has no gender, but God's not a creation. So Torah Hebrew is not describing God. But since everything God created has gender, God says, I don't need a neutral gender because I don't need to label anything neutral. Everything's masculine or feminine, or some combination of both. Which means, from a Torah perspective, air has gender, water has gender, rocks have gender, buildings have gender, everything is gender. So in English, I can say about the book, could you pass it to me? You can't do that in Hebrew. You can say, pass him to me. So therefore, if we have, according to the Torah, gender applies to everything, we need a broader definition of gender than you use in English to describe a sexual differentiation between something that's male and female. Do you hear the problem? So therefore, here are two very, very critical definitions of masculine and feminine according to the Torah. And I urge you to take these down in your notebook or at least commit them to memory, because if you get the Torah's perspective of gender clear, lots of things in Judaism that make no sense whatsoever will start making more sense. Okay? So let's do masculine. From the Torah perspective, masculine means to give over or to affect something outside of yourself. So therefore, even if I were a woman guest lecturer here at Neve, while I teach you Torah, I'm being masculine relative to you because I'm giving over Torah and I'm affecting you with it. That's a masculine interaction, regardless of what your gender is. That's the basic bottom line definition of masculine, to give over to affect something outside of yourself. What's the definition of feminine? So feminine always means to take something, work on it, and raise it to a higher level. When you take something, work on it, raise it to a higher level, you're being feminine relative to whatever it is. So therefore, let's create a scenario here. I'm a woman guest lecturer. You're all men from some yeshiva. So while I'm teaching you Torah and giving over and affecting you with it, I, Mrs. whatever her name is, am being masculine relative to you men. At least while I'm teaching you. You men can be feminine relative to me if you take what you learn, work on yourselves and make yourselves better people. Or if you take what you learn, get out there and make the world a better place. That's a feminine response to the masculine giving over. Okay, any questions on that? Because I have to add a little bit more that makes it a little bit more complex. Okay, that's the basic step one definition. So far, so good? Okay, now. The masculine side, therefore, if it's giving over and affecting, is associated with the character trait we call chesed. Chesed is, what can I do for you? How can I help you? Chesed is giving. Chesed is caring. So that ability to give over and affect outside of yourself is what we call the side of chesed. We actually discussed chesed when we discussed Abraham when we were doing the letter Gimel. Okay? So therefore, the masculine side is the giving over side. Now, the masculine side is not associated with limitation. Meaning, my ability to give over an effect outside of myself really is not easily contained. For example, I could stand in this room and teach Torah for the next 24 hours. After a while, let's say you get bored, you put your headset on your desk, you go to sleep, you leave. But that doesn't block me from continuing to give over information. You're interested, you're not so interested, I can just keep giving over for the next 24 hours. Now, it doesn't mean anything results from what I'm giving over, but that doesn't stop me from giving it over. So we're going to say the masculine side is not the side associated with limitation. The feminine side is the opposite. The feminine side uses as a mechanism rules and limitations to take something to a higher level. Remember, what's the definition of feminine? Taking something, working on it, and raising it to a higher level. What's the mechanism the feminine side uses to take something, work on it, raise it to a higher level? Rules and limitations. That's the mechanism we call din. And when we were doing the letter Gimel, we talked about Yitzchak being prototypical and working on this particular character trait. Din is rules. Din is setting limits. Din sometimes refers to strict justice. So you see, the feminine side is the side associated with rules and limitations, and that's what enables you to take things to a higher level. Because without rules and limitations, you really can't. You can't accomplish anything without rules and limitations. Whereas the masculine side of giving over isn't really associated with what's accomplished. It's associated with the transmission. You follow? I'll give you an example. Let's say you say to me, listen, Rabbi Marcus, I'm 20 years old, and I've thought about this for the last year, and I've decided that by the time I'm 25, I'm going to be a doctor who's a lawyer, who's an accountant, who's an engineer, who's backpacked across Europe. I'm like, whoa, I'm impressed. That's unbelievable. Fabulous. But trust me, if you don't limit yourself down to one of those options, you'll get none. No, you'll probably be able to backpack across Europe. But the other ones, forget it. See, if you limit yourself down to just being a psychologist, by the time you're 25, you could be a fabulous psychologist. But if you don't use rules and limitations to take yourself to a higher level, chances are you'll be incompetent and fail at everything. So we all got through high school, we all got through college by understanding that rules and limitations take us to a higher level. You can't get an A on your exam unless when your best friends are going out for dinner or going to the movies or going shopping, you say, no, I think I'll sit home and study. I'd rather do a dozen things tonight. Yeah, but if I don't apply rules and limits to myself, I'll flunk the course. And the people who are the most disciplined about rules and limitations are the ones who typically go for the Olympics and try to get gold, right? So the masculine side is not associated with limitation. The feminine side is. So let's bring a example of masculine versus feminine, but let's not talk people. Let's talk things so that you can see masculine and feminine abstracted a little bit. And I'll bring it back into our class after I do this example. Let's talk the building industry. Let's say the phone company is building a new office building because they're expanding, they're hiring 500 new employees, they have a $30 million budget, they own a flat piece of land, they go to an architect and say, can you design us a building for 500 employees? Now that architect, I don't care whether it's a man or a woman, it's irrelevant for my example, but let's say it's a he. So he's going to be intensely masculine because he says to the phone company, oh, you want a building for 500 employees? I've been designing buildings for 30 years. I can design you tall buildings, short buildings, elevators outside, elevators inside, hollow atriums, glass, metal, steel, you name it, I can design you any design you want. That's what I do for a living. So what you're getting is the masculine side of architecture is the ability to give over without limitation, idea after idea after idea after idea. Total creativity. Nothing's really being accomplished per se, but at least there's a lot of giving over. So what's the phone company say? The phone company says to the guy, listen, we don't need 1,000 drawings of buildings. What are we going to do? Put the drawings on the ground and tell our employees to stand on your drawings? No. So therefore, the phone company is going to force some feminine limitation on the masculine architecture. And they're going to limit him down to one. Now you lose the 1,000 potential designs, but you're now at a stage where you can build something. So by becoming more feminine, we become closer able to take it to a higher level than just the idea of the building. So therefore, the architecture starts out intensely masculine, total creativity giving over, and as it progresses, we force it to become more and more feminine as we limit him down to one, which we then put on blueprints and working drawings and design drawings, right? So that's a masculine architectural process that becomes slightly more feminine. The construction team is feminine. Don't tell these guys that. Wouldn't be safe, but they're feminine. Why? Because what they're going to do is take that one drawing, work on it hard for a year, and raise it to a higher level. What's a higher level than the idea on the paper? The building for 500 employees. It takes a year's worth of work and $30 million, and finally you can put your employees in there. So that's a feminine construction process. But even the feminine construction process, which takes it to a higher level, starts out slightly masculine. Why? Because they can give over from past building experience how to do it faster, how to do it safely, how to do it cheaper. Things like, when we build this thing, we're not going to put the carpets in till we put the windows in because we don't want it to rain on the carpet. So they can give over from past experience. So even the feminine construction team starts slightly masculine. And then as they build, they become more feminine until they finally accomplish taking it to a higher level, and that's the finished building. So let's look at the whole design process. We start intensely masculine with an architect giving over 1,000 ideas, and he becomes more feminine. We start with a feminine construction process that starts slightly masculine, and by the time it's done, it's intensely feminine. So we start intensely masculine, we end intensely feminine, and somewhere in the middle it got gray and we crossed over. You follow? So that pattern is how the world's running. I mean, look at human biology. God built human beings based on this principle. So therefore, in human sexuality, sexual reproduction is a man gives over and he affects somebody outside of himself. He can walk away. And not only does he give over and affect somebody outside of himself, but think about it for a second. I don't know if you remember your high school biology, but a man gives over in any intimate relationship. A man's giving over 350 million potential children. And the United States only has 300 million people in it. He's giving over more potential children than the population in the United States. That is giving over, metaphorically speaking, with no limitation. That's masculine. What's she going to do? So the feminine side says, what am I going to do with 350 million potential children? So she's going to limit him down to one and work hard on it for the next 9 months and take it to a higher level. What's the higher level than the idea he gave over 9 months ago? Human being with the neshama. That's only being expressed out on the feminine side. So that's the construction. That's taking the idea to a higher level. So now, a man who's giving over 350 million potential children with no limitation, the way he's designed, he can still do that when he's 90 years old. In other words, he's still giving over 350 million potential children because the masculine side is not associated with limitation, so he's doing this his entire lifetime. But a woman's born with, whatever it is, finite number of eggs in her ovaries, starting, let's say, age 12, she ovulates one per month. By the time she's 40, 50 years old, no more kids, because her side is the side of limitation. But that's the side that actually takes the idea and takes it to a higher level. That's a feminine process. And really, when you look at human beings, you'll see that men and women are what men and women are 80%, 85% similar, just in terms of the design of human bodies. So that's a hint that there's tremendous overlap in the way God designed men and women. Meaning, you're not locked into whatever gender you are. You can play either part of the process depending on the interaction. For example, I'll give you when I'm teaching you Torah, I'm being masculine relative to you. But when I'm learning Torah from my rabbi, I'm being feminine relative to him, because I'm going to take what he teaches me, work on myself, and make myself a better person. Or I'm going to take what he teaches me, get out there and make the world a better place. So I can be feminine relative to him and masculine relative to you. So when you're raising children, for example, a lot of what you do is giving over and affecting them, but you have to teach them to be givers. So you have to be feminine relative to them sometimes. So really, you're capable of either. I remember I took a course in biology where we looked at certain marine organisms. And, you know, if you weren't an expert, you'd say, well, this is a plant and this is a fish, because this one grows and this one swims. And an expert would say, no, that's the female, that's the male. You say, you got to be kidding me. So there's an example where there's just no overlap. Whereas human beings, you see there's tremendous overlap. So you can actually, in interactions, play either role. Okay? So now, let's look on a cellular level. If you go down to a cellular level, you'll see that there's overlap from the masculine and feminine. Okay? Let's do, back to high school biology again, male and female reproductive cells. You'll see that male and female reproductive cells really have both aspects. Okay? Let's take a male reproductive cell. That cell is going to be both masculine and feminine. Think back to high school biology. What aspect of a male reproductive cell is masculine, meaning it gives over architecturally what the building, or in this case, the baby, should look like? All the DNA. What the baby ends up looking like is not determined by just the X and Y. It's all the base pairs of chromosomes. So all the DNA is masculine, right? Now, what aspect of that cell is feminine, meaning it's not determining what the child looks like, but without it, you don't get the child, meaning it's necessary for construction? It's a trick question. The answer is everything else. The cytoplasm, the cell wall, everything. Anything else in that cell is necessary to construct a child, but it's not dictating what the child looks like. It's not architectural, meaning it's feminine. Okay, blank stares. So, let me give you an example. I'm an architect. I've got DNA dictating what the building's going to look like. I call up Federal Express or UPS. Send me a truck to deliver my blueprints to the other side of the city where there's a construction site, right? That's where the egg is. So the truck is feminine because it's necessary for construction, but it's not allowed to dictate what the child looks like. The DNA being carried by the truck is masculine in that it's part of the design. Does that make sense? Yes. So the truck is feminine, but the DNA being carried is masculine. But you see, in a male reproductive cell, there's both aspects. Okay? I'm trying to show you that there's overlap here. Okay? So now, let's take the other cell. Let's take an egg cell. The male reproductive cell is the smallest, I'm trying to remember back to high school biology, the smallest cell in the human body, or at least one of the smallest cells in the human body, as far as I remember. And therefore, what can we say? We can say this cell is intensely masculine, because it's mostly DNA, with a small, short-lived feminine component. So we don't have to say it's 50-50, masculine, feminine. Right? As a matter of fact, the cell is so small and has so little cytoplasm with so few nutrients, it only lasts about 72 hours, then it dies. So it's intensely masculine, but it has a very small, short-lived feminine component. This cell, the female reproductive cell, is the exact opposite. What aspect of that cell is masculine, meaning it dictates what the child looks like? DNA. Do you guys cover this in high school biology? You don't want to answer because you're being recorded? They don't teach this stuff?
My school was too long ago.
Okay, fine. Okay. So DNA. And since she's got half the DNA, this egg cell's got half the DNA, she is equally architectural as he is. They're both equally dictating what the building looks like or the child looks like, right? But what aspect of that cell is feminine, meaning it's not dictating what the child looks like, but without it, you don't get the building. You don't get the child. Everything else. Everything else. Everything in the cytoplasm, the proteins, the sugars, the carbohydrate, everything in there is going to end up constructing the child. So in this case, we don't have to say it's 50-50 either. It's not half male, half female. In other words, this cell's intensely feminine. It's one of the largest cells in the human body. And unlike the male reproductive cell, it doesn't last 72 hours. It divides and 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 lasts 80, 90, 100, 120 years. Who knows how long? Because this becomes the child. So what we can say is this is intensely feminine with a small masculine component. Whereas this one's intensely masculine with a small feminine component. So even though both sides have both, you don't have to say it's 50-50. It's not. Okay, questions on this? So I want you to remember this overlap we have in reproductive cells, because we're going to come back to it next week when we go a little bit further along in the material. I'm going to say, you remember a few classes ago we talked about male and female reproductive cells in terms of gender? And I'm hoping that the room nods yes, okay? Because we need more information before we come back to these cells. Okay, good. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Will this work for individual words? Like, will it work for both in Hebrew?
So as a general rule, Torah follows the principle that feminine words have the integration of the masculine and feminine together, and masculine words lack it. And we're going to see why, based on these rules of masculine and feminine, why this pattern in Hebrew grammar is going to make sense. I just have to take you a little further to get it to make sense. I'm just setting it up right now. You see, we said if masculine lacks the hay and feminine has the hay typically, then what's masculine, what's feminine? Because our definitions we grew up with don't apply to wood or rocks, dirt, buildings. So Shem says everything has gender. So 1 second. God has no gender. God says, yeah, but words don't describe me. But everything else I created, I have words to describe, and they have to carry gender because everything has gender. So everything you see is male, female, or some sort of blending. And that's what we're going to try to figure out, okay? So we'll stop over here, and on Sunday we'll continue with more on this topic.